when I hear this second reading, the epistle, there are parts of it that I don't really like. Like when it says, God was not pleased with most of them, and they were struck down in the wilderness. God didn't like them, so he struck them down. And then it says, do not indulge in sexual immorality, as some of them did, and 23,000 fell in a single day. Yikes. And then it says, don't put Christ to the test, as some of them did. They were destroyed by serpents. Okay? And then even, do not complain. Okay, don't even complain, as some did. They were destroyed by the destroyer. And it kind of feeds into this idea that when bad things happen to people, it must be something they did, right? It must be that they displeased God in some way. And I think of that, it comes up in the Bible. It does. There's that place when Jesus is presented with the man who had been born blind. And do you remember what the people asked Jesus? Who sinned? Was it this man, or was it his parents that he was born blind? And it's hard to imagine. If you're born blind, that means if it was him, he had to have sinned before he was even born. So, and of course, that's a question that they asked, and to me it seems a little ridiculous. But we do that too, right? It's not just a thing that happened in the Bible. We want to blame somebody for misfortunes. And I think even if we don't realize it, we tend to want to do that. And Jesus in this gospel very clearly says that actually is not how it works. There were two disasters that he alludes to, one is Pilate apparently killing Galileans while they were sacrificing in the temple and mixing their blood with the sacrifice, which is a huge sacrilege. These events aren't corroborated in any other historical text. It's just something that his audience and Luke must have known about. And he says, do you think that they sinned more than anybody? No, they didn't. It wasn't that they brought it on themselves. And when the disaster hit and the tower fell and people were killed, do you think they sinned more? Jesus very clearly says no. But he does say, and yet we must all be accountable, right? So it's not like we can do whatever we want and not worry. I'm not trying to give you that message. So please don't go home and say, Julia said, I don't have to, I can do whatever I want. But I think that we tend to want to find some kind of blame or some kind of reason that things happen to people, because I think it helps us feel more secure. And I have a couple of examples of that. The first is when that Yugo went over the Mackinac Bridge. Do you guys remember that? That was so horrible. And I am somebody who for many, many years has crossed that bridge several times a year, because I go to the Upper Peninsula. And I remember when that happened, I was talking to one of my friends from the UP about the thing, because it was kind of like, oh, yikes. And she said, well, she shouldn't have been driving so fast. And I thought, well, she didn't deserve to die because she was driving too fast. But I think that was Katie's way of saying, I'm going to be safe. It won't happen to me because I'm always really careful and I don't speed on the Mackinac Bridge. The other time was I was 22 years old, and my nephew, who was just a week short of 2 years old, drowned. And it was a horrible, horrible tragedy, as you know. His name was Stephen Mark Brown, and I put his picture up here every All Saints Day. And I have a memory of reading, and there was a story in the paper about it. And I remember as I was reading that story, my brain was doing something that I never knew it did. It was a kind of an automatic defense. And my brain was doing the thing that says, oh, well, they were probably not very well educated, or they were different from me in some way, and I had to stop my brain and say, you don't know what you're talking about. This is me. This is not somebody different from me. This is my family. But I realized that I would do that I would try and make it other in a way to make myself safe. And it caught me up short, and it has kind of helped me to try not to do that. But I think we do that, when we see someone who is struggling, who is homeless. I think it's easy for us to think, well, they must have made some very bad decisions. And you know what? I have made some very bad decisions in my life. And here I am. Yes, sometimes it is things that we do. That doesn't mean we deserve it. And sometimes it isn't things we do. There are circumstances beyond our control. So I think part of my take from this gospel is to be more compassionate, to try not to do that othering thing. Just to remember that Jesus said, as you do to the least of these, you do it to me. We are all Jesus. We are all in that one way or the other. And then the other thing is, as he goes on, after he makes those statements in the gospel, he tells this little parable about a fig tree. So it's a fig tree, and for 3 years it hasn't produced fruit. So the owner says to the gardener, I think it's time to dig up that fig tree. It's just taking up space, and we don't have a lot of extra space. It's not doing anything for us. I want you to dig that up. And the gardener says, maybe not quite so fast. Let's not only give it more time, because that would be one thing. Let's give it another year. Probably next year it will bear fruit. But not only give it more time, he says, let me help it. Let me dig up around a bit, and let me fertilize it, and let me give it encouragement and help. And then maybe next year it will bear fruit. And then he says, if another year goes by and it still hasn't borne fruit, then we can cut it down. And in my imagination, I like to think that maybe the next year comes and it still hasn't borne fruit, and the gardener says, it's true, it hasn't quite borne fruit, but it's getting better. Look at it, how much healthier it is. I think next year it's going to. Let me keep working on it and helping it. Just like God might be saying, oh my, I gave Julia every opportunity to improve this way of her life and to help her think better about this or that, and it just hasn't borne any fruit. And God says, well, let's give her another chance. Let's help her along. Let's give her some ways that she can learn. Let's stir up the soil and put a little crap on it. Maybe that'll help her. And I think that that's a beautiful thing. And I think that God does that. And it's an expression of God's love, mercy. When we end our service today, we're going to sing, There's a Wideness in God's Mercy, which is one of my favorite texts. We actually have 2 beautiful tunes to it, so we're going to sing one of them this week and another one in a week or 2. There's a wideness in God's mercy like the wideness of the sea. There's a kindness in his justice, which is more than liberty. And it ends, for the love of God is broader than the measure of the mind, but beyond what we can even imagine. And the heart of the eternal is most wonderfully kind. And there's a text in the long poem by Faber that isn't included in our hymnal. It's not in this hymn. There are several verses that aren't included. But the one I'm thinking of goes like this. But we make God's love too narrow by false limits of our own. And we magnify his strictness with a zeal he will not own. And I think that happens. I think we want to put things in God's, and credit God or fault God with narrow rules and narrow limits that aren't God's at all. Talk about blaming people for their trials, have you ever heard a famous preacher claim that a certain natural disaster was God's punishment for a certain thing, a certain sin? And I just can't believe that. Usually the certain sin isn't one that I think God is too worried about anyway. And I don't think that's how God works. But sometimes we want to do that. And I think to not make God's love too narrow with false limits, and not to magnify God's strictness with a zeal God will not own, but to proclaim the wideness of God's mercy, the wideness of God's love beyond our comprehension, that God is always there for all of us, for this community, for Trinity in the Woods, for each of us, saying, oh, I know they can do even better. Let's just stir up the soil a little bit. Let's get some fertilizer on there. Let's give them things that will help them strengthen. Amen.